how much do we really know about where we come from? It's a question that can lead you down some truly fascinating rabbit holes, right?
Totally.
Especially when history is long and it's marked by these huge migrations, and often it's kind of shrouded in layers of time and tradition.
Yeah, the picture can get pretty blurry.
So today, we're taking a deep dive into the, well, often surprising, history and genetic origins of Ashkenazi Jews.
A really intricate story.
It is. And for this deep dive, we've pulled together some truly remarkable research. We're looking at cutting-edge ancient DNA studies, stuff published in top journals like Cell.
Which is amazing. It's like getting clues directly from the past.
Exactly, literally from the dust of centuries. And we're weaving that in with comprehensive historical overviews, modern genetic analyses.
Yeah.
The whole picture.
Right.
Our mission really is to help you unravel what is a genuinely intricate and sometimes, let's be honest, intensely debated story.
For sure.
We want to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, kind of give you a shortcut to being well-informed on this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Our goal here is to, illuminate some of the surprising facts that pop up when you put history and genetics side by side. We want to help you understand what shaped, one of the world's most distinct populations.
Without getting totally overwhelmed.
Hopefully not. We'll explore the ancient roots, the really complex migrations, and those genetic threads that connect the past right up to the present.
And we're definitely going to unpack one of the most persistent and maybe controversial theories in this field.
Ah, yes, the so-called Khazar hypothesis. We'll get into that.
Okay, let's unpack this then. To start, who exactly are Ashkenazi Jews? I mean, lots of people have heard the term, but the full meaning, the historical context, it's incredibly rich.
It really is. So traditionally, the term Ashkenazi defines the descendants of Jews who lived in Central or Eastern Europe.
Okay.
It initially emerged as a distinct cultural group that really found its footing in the Rhineland, Western Germany. That was around the 10th century.
So quite a while ago.
Oh, yeah. And this wasn't just like a random scattering of people. It was the formation of identifiable communities. They developed unique traditions, customs, a distinct linguistic identity.
Right, a real culture coalescing.
Exactly. And then over centuries, this geographic and cultural identity spread out significantly across the continent, particularly moving eastward.
And when we look at the demographics today, the story is quite striking, isn't it? The numbers.
It is, yeah. Today, about half of all Jewish people globally identify as Ashkenazi.
Half, okay.
But, and this is crucial to understand, that percentage has shifted dramatically. If you go back to 1930, before the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust,
Yeah.
Ashkenazi Jews were estimated to be nearly 92% of the world's Jewish population. 92%.
Wow, that's huge.
The sheer scale of the genocide just fundamentally reshaped global Jewish demographics. So the post-Holocaust estimates, they range more from about 75% to maybe 85%.
Just that shift alone tells such a profound story.
It really does. Story of, survival and resilience against truly unimaginable odds.
And culturally, a major identifier for Ashkenazi Jews has traditionally been Yiddish. What does that language tell us about their journey?
Ah, Yiddish.
Okay.
It's a linguistic marvel, really. It's fundamentally a Germanic language, which might surprise some people.
Right, based in German.
Yeah, but it's uniquely written using Hebrew letters. And its vocabulary, its structure, it pulls in significant influences from Hebrew and Aramaic, reflecting those ancient roots.
Makes sense.
But also from Romance languages and later Slavic languages, which really showcases the history of migration and interaction with all these different European cultures.
So the language itself is like a map of their history.
In a way, yes. It embodies this blend of diverse origins and experiences. It served as a kind of cultural glue for centuries.
And this cultural evolution, it goes way beyond just language, right? They were constantly adapting traditions.
Absolutely. They adapted their traditions to the European context they found themselves in. And there was a really significant reorientation, particularly in the late 18th and 19th centuries.
What drove that?
Well, it was largely driven by two really powerful forces.
Okay.
One was the Haskalah, that's the Jewish Enlightenment.
Okay.
And the other was the broader struggle for emancipation in European societies, gaining civil rights.
Right, trying to integrate more.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Haskalah encouraged Jews to engage more deeply with secular knowledge, to integrate into wider society. And emancipation offered, often conditionally, mind you, new legal and social freedoms.
And that had big effects.
Oh, profound effects, especially in urban centers. This intellectual and cultural ferment led some, especially among the, let's say, the educated classes, to abandon Yiddish in favor of German or other national languages.
Interesting.
And this era also saw the development of entirely new forms of Jewish religious life, like Reform Judaism, and new expressions of cultural identity that moved beyond those traditional communal structures.
And throughout all these shifts, all these challenges, Ashkenazi Jews made really significant contributions across Europe, didn't they? Impacting everything from philosophy to science.
Absolutely. Their cultural life was incredibly vibrant, even when facing discrimination and persecution, which was often the case.
Right.
And that fueled remarkable achievements. They made profound contributions to European philosophy, scholarship, literature, art, music, science, you name it.
Any famous examples spring to mind?
Oh, sure. Think of figures like Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, Gustav Mahler, all from Ashkenazi backgrounds, and they fundamentally shaped modern thought and culture.
Wow.
So this rich tapestry of contribution really underscores their deep integration into and impact on the societies they lived in.
So if we trace this all the way back, where did these early European communities actually come from? We know the Ashkenazi identity kind of solidified in Germany, but the roots go much deeper, don't they?
Oh, much, much deeper. Their roots are incredibly ancient. They trace back to the Israelites and Hebrews of historical Israel and Judah.
So the same origin as other Jewish groups?
Exactly. The shared ancestral heritage connects them with all other Jewish populations globally, Sephardic, Mizrahi, you name it. The story of Jews in Europe begins long before the term Ashkenazi was even used.
How early are we talking?
Well, as early as the 4th century BCE, you start seeing Jewish colonies popping up in southern Europe. Places like the Aegean Islands, Greece, Italy.
4th century BCE, that's really early.
It is. We have evidence, for instance, in Puteoli, Italy, as early as 4 BCE. And these initial movements seem to have been largely driven by opportunities in trade and commerce. Jewish merchants were establishing networks across the Mediterranean.
And then came the Roman conquests, the Jewish-Roman wars. Those must have been seismic events for Jewish dispersal.
Oh, absolutely transformative periods.
Yeah.
The Roman Republic's conquest of Judea in 63 BCE, particularly the siege of Jerusalem, that led to thousands of Jewish prisoners of war being brought to Rome as slaves. Many, after gaining their freedom, settled permanently in Rome as traders. And there were likely other influxes of Jewish slaves too, like after Herod the Great captured Jerusalem and following other smaller revolts.
So both forced and voluntary migration early on.
Exactly. The historian E. Mary Smallwood points out that while some settlements definitely date to those catastrophic revolts in 66-70 CE and 132-135 CE.
The big ones.
Yeah, the ones that really devastated Judea. Many settlements probably originated from earlier voluntary immigration, people drawn by the, quote, lure of trade and commerce.
Makes sense. But those wars must have accelerated things.
Dramatically.
Huh.
The First Jewish-Roman War, 66-73 CE, ended with the destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple, a hugely traumatic event.
Yeah.
Josephus, the historian, he records 97,000 sold into slavery just after that revolt. Then only a few decades later, you have the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 to 136 CE, which further devastated Judea.
Or destruct.
More killing, more displacement, more people sold into slavery. And crucially, Jews were explicitly prohibited from entering Aelia Capitolina, that was the Roman name for rebuilt Jerusalem.
So they were effectively barred from their homeland.
Pretty much. This period certainly led to a significant, often forced dwindling of Jewish presence in the Levant. It prompted more outward migration and definitely strengthened those diaspora communities already forming in Europe.
And this continuous pressure, it eventually pushed them further north into Europe, right? Away from the Mediterranean core.
Precisely. After Christianity became the official Roman religion in 380 CE, Jews faced increasing marginalization, more legal restrictions within the empire.
So life got harder.
It did. But then the expansion of Charlemagne's empire around 800 CE actually offered new, quite compelling opportunities, especially for Jewish merchants north of the Alps.
Oh, interesting. What kind of opportunities?
Well, they often took up roles in finance, particularly money lending. This was an activity often prohibited for Christians by the church because of usury laws.
Ah, the niche opened up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It created a specific economic niche that kind of fueled their movement and settlement in new areas. They served as these vital intermediaries in Europe's burgeoning trade networks, connecting different regions, fostering economic growth.
And by the 11th century, we start seeing these really pivotal communities emerge in the Rhineland. Speer, Worms, Mainz. the Shum cities?
Yes, exactly. The Shem city. These weren't just settlements. They became vibrant intellectual and religious centers.
The cradle of Ashkenazi culture,
You should
essentially.
definitely say that. They became the cradle of the Ashkenazi religious tradition of Talmudic studies. They developed this unique synthesis of Jewish law, mysticism, communal organization that would really define Ashkenazi Judaism for centuries.
What were they like, these communities?
Well, they were characterized by strong internal self-governance, really rich scholarly traditions, and a deep sense of communal identity, even while navigating, the often precarious existence of being a minority in medieval Europe.
So they laid the foundation.
A crucial cultural and intellectual foundation for what became a distinct and, well, incredibly resilient Jewish culture.
Okay, so we have this incredibly rich historical narrative, right? Stretching back centuries, across continents, movements driven by trade, conquest, opportunity. But genetics, especially ancient DNA, gives us this amazing new lens.
And really,
It provides clues that historical records just can't always offer. So what are the broad strokes? What's ancient DNA telling us that helps piece this story together?
that's a great question because, DNA from people living today gives us powerful hints about the past, right? We can infer things.
Sure.
But ancient DNA, it's like orders of magnitude more informative. It's like a biological time machine, genuinely.
How so? What can it show us?
Well, it can directly document specific migrations. It can show the continuity of a population over time in one place. It can reveal their precise size, even their marriage patterns.
Marriage patterns
Right.
from DNA.
Yeah, by looking at genetic similarity between individuals buried near each other, for instance. And it can highlight subtle ancestry differences, even between relatives buried centuries ago. It's giving us this molecular snapshot of past populations.
And a groundbreaking example of this is the Erfurt study from 2022. That sounds like an extraordinary piece of research.
Oh, it was, definitely. It was the largest study of its kind to date, analyzing DNA from 33 individuals buried in a medieval Jewish cemetery in Erfurt, Germany.
Erfurt. So right in the heart of where Ashkenazi communities were developing.
Exactly. This community existed roughly between the 11th and 15th centuries. But there's a notable gap in the burials around 1349.
Why the gap?
That was due to a devastating massacre during the Black Death persecutions, a really dark chapter.
Right, of course.
And the site itself, it later became a granary and then even a parking lot, which ironically kind of protected the remains from later disturbances.
So it allowed for a rescue excavation.
Precisely. When the site was redeveloped, they could do this careful excavation. And the researchers, working closely with the local Jewish community, got a special permit to retrieve DNA, specifically from detached teeth that had already been carefully collected.
That sounds incredibly meticulous.
The whole process was remarkable, from the archaeology to the sensitive ethical considerations involved.
So what were the key findings? What did this unprecedented look into medieval Ashkenazi life reveal? Maybe some surprises.
Well, probably the most significant finding from Erfurt was that the modern Ashkenazi population, it largely formed as a mix of distinct subgroups that were already present in medieval Erfurt.
Already distinct back then.
Yes. This kind of challenges the simpler image of a purely linear migration. It suggests a much earlier, more dynamic internal shaping of the population.
What were these subgroups like?
Well, one subgroup showed greater Middle Eastern ancestry. These were likely the more direct descendants of Jews with origins in Western Germany, maybe from those Rhineland communities we just talked about. The other group had greater Eastern and Central European ancestry mixed in.
Ah, so different genetic profiles coexisting.
Exactly. And crucially, the study found that after this initial mixing happened, likely by the 14th century, there was very little to no outside genetic influence absorbed by this population over the next 600 years.
600 years, wow. So very little mixing with non-Jewish neighbors after that point.
Extremely little, genetically speaking. It indicates a very high degree of endogamy marrying within the group, which effectively preserved this unique genetic blend that had formed by the Middle Ages. The Erfurt study also provided really powerful evidence for what geneticists call a founder event.
Right, you mentioned that earlier, the population bottleneck.
Exactly. It's when a large population shrinks dramatically down to a small number of individuals, maybe just a few hundred or even fewer.
And those few become the ancestors for everyone later on.
Precisely. And because this small founding group carries only a fraction of the original genetic diversity, certain rare genetic variations, including those that cause diseases, can become much more common just by chance in the subsequent larger population.
And they found evidence of this in Erfurt.
Clearly, the study found some specific disease-causing mutations that are widespread in modern Ashkenazi Jews today. Things like the mutations for Tay-Sachs disease were already present in the medieval Erfurt population.
Wow, so that bottleneck happened very early.
It powerfully indicates that the modern Ashkenazi population indeed originated from an extremely small set of founders, probably much earlier than Erfurt, maybe in the first millennium CE.
And didn't you say something about the mitochondrial DNA, the maternal lines?
Yes. The analysis of mitochondrial DNA, which traces only the direct maternal line, revealed that fully one-third of the Erfurt individuals descended from a single ancestral woman.
One-third from one woman.
One single maternal lineage. It just underscores how incredibly small and genetically constricted that founding population must have been.
This raises such an important question. How does this incredibly detailed genetic story, especially from ancient DNA like Erfurt, actually align with the historical narratives? The migrations, the population shifts we discussed earlier, it seems like it's painting a very clear picture.
It really helps bridge that gap, between the historical records, which can sometimes be sparse or biased, and the biological reality recorded in DNA.
So what does Erfurt confirm or clarify?
Well, it shows that by the 14th century, Ashkenazi Jews had already acquired their main sources of genetic ancestry, including those significant components from Eastern Europe.
So the mixing had largely happened by then.
It seems so. And those ancestry components changed very little over the next 6 centuries. But this doesn't mean it was a static population internally.
How so?
The study revealed that the internal genetic structure of Ashkenazi Jews has actually shifted over time. Medieval Ashkenazi Jews were not the single, relatively homogeneous community we largely see today.
More diverse back then.
Genetically, yes. They were more like an archipelago of communities, as the researchers put it. Each community might have been affected differently by founder events, or had slightly different mixtures with local populations, leading to distinct genetic profiles within the broader Ashkenazi group.
So it wasn't just one monolithic group expanding outwards, but maybe multiple distinct subgroups converging and contributing.
Precisely. The researchers identified this clear division. One medieval group looked genetically similar to present-day Western European Ashkenazi Jews, maybe those Rhineland descendants.
Okay.
The other group had additional Eastern European ancestry mixed in, perhaps representing medieval Ashkenazi Jews who had moved further into Central or Eastern Europe earlier on.
And these groups might have been culturally distinct too.
It's possible. They might have been culturally, maybe even linguistically distinct at the time, perhaps speaking different dialects of early Yiddish or interacting more with different local non-Jewish populations. It just underscores that Ashkenazi identity formed through this dynamic process over centuries, not a single uniform expansion. And another key point from Erfurt. A major source of the pre-medieval Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry is clearly related to people living today in Mediterranean Southern Europe.
So confirming that migration path. Middle East, through Southern Europe, then north.
Exactly. It fits perfectly with the historical migration paths we talked about, originating in ancient Israel, moving through Southern Europe, before heading north into Central and Eastern Europe. The genetics really supports that journey.
And it reinforces the small population size idea too.
Absolutely. The ancient DNA paints this picture of a very small population size during those early centuries of the second millennium. That's what allowed certain disease-causing mutations to drift to higher frequencies, the classic founder effect signature. Combine that with the mitochondrial DNA finding about the single woman ancestor for a third of them. It paints a really consistent picture of a unique population history.
Okay, so if we connect this ancient DNA picture to the bigger story, what about the specific lineages? What do the Y chromosome studies tell us specifically about the male line? That's passed just father to son, right? Must hold some compelling clues.
It does, yeah. The Y chromosome is a powerful tool for this because it passes down largely unchanged from father to son, generation after generation. It's like a direct paternal surname, genetically speaking.
And what does it show for Ashkenazi men?
Well, the Y chromosome paints a remarkably consistent picture, really, across numerous studies over the years. This is where we look at haplogroups. These are essentially major branches on the human Y chromosome family tree, indicating shared ancestry along the male line. And the consensus is strong. Most studies, including some pioneering work back in 2000 by Hammer and then Nibble in 2001-2005, they all show that the male lines of Ashkenazi Jews are predominantly from the Middle East.
Predominantly Middle Eastern.
Yes. Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, for instance, they share specific genetic mutations on the Y chromosome that are common among Middle Eastern peoples, think Levantines, Mesopotamians, but are conspicuously uncommon among indigenous Europeans.
So that strongly supports a Near Eastern origin for the paternal side.
It powerfully supports a Near Eastern paternal origin, yes, for both major Jewish groups, Ashkenazi and Sephardic, suggesting a shared origin before their paths diverged geographically.
And what about the level of European genetic input into these male lines? Was there much mixing with local European men over the centuries?
That's another striking finding. It appears remarkably low. Studies have estimated less than 0.5% male genetic admixture, meaning input from outside the group per generation over something like 80 generations.
Less than 0.5% per generation? That's tiny.
It's really minimal. It suggests, and I'm quoting here, a relatively minor contribution of European Y chromosomes to the Ashkenazi male gene pool.
So, strong genetic continuity on the male side.
Extremely strong. This genetic evidence really backs up the historical picture of Jewish communities often maintaining a distinct lineage, exhibiting a high degree of endogamy, even as they migrated through and settled in diverse parts of Europe. It speaks to remarkable genetic continuity over a very long time.
Now, there was one particular genetic signature, though, the R1A haplogroup, that caused some debate, didn't it?
Yeah.
Regarding its origin.
Yes, R1A. That's a crucial nuance and a great example of how science refines itself.
What was the issue?
Well, initially, the presence of this R1A haplogroup among Ashkenazi Jews, it's found at reasonably high frequencies, maybe around 13% overall, but even higher in specific subgroups like the Levites.
Levites, the priestly lineage.
Traditionally, yes. Among Ashkenazi Levites, R1A can reach as high as 50%. And this haplogroup R1A is very, very common in Central and Eastern Europeans. In some Slavic populations, for example, it can be found in a huge portion of men, sometimes 50, even 60%.
So the thinking was maybe this came from mixing with Europeans?
That was the logical initial hypothesis for some researchers. Maybe this represented significant gene flow from surrounding European populations into the Ashkenazi gene pool, specifically into the Levite lineage.
But later studies challenged that.
Yes, later, much more refined studies, particularly one by Behar and colleagues in 2017, focused specifically on Ashkenazi Levites because of that high R1A frequency. They dug deeper.
And what did they find?
They didn't just look at R1A broadly. They looked at very specific genetic signatures within R1A, like unique sub-branches of that haplogroup family tree.
Finer resolution.
Much finer. And instead of finding typical European R1A variants, they identified a distinct subclade called R1AY 2619, which is almost unique to Ashkenazi Levites. It's different from the common European R1A branches.
So it's their own specific type of R1A.
Exactly. And when they traced the origins of this specific fingerprint of R1A, this R1AY 2619, it pointed directly to a local Middle Eastern origin.
Yeah.
Not European.
Wow. So even the R1A seems to be Middle Eastern in origin.
For this specific lineage, yes. This finding, they said, firmly validated a Near Eastern paternal origin for this specific Levite lineage. It effectively resolved that particular debate and strongly reinforced the overall picture of Middle Eastern paternal ancestry for Ashkenazi Jews.
That's a fantastic example of how more data and better techniques refine the picture.
Absolutely. Science constantly building on itself.
Okay, so the paternal side seems pretty clear. Largely Middle Eastern origin, strong continuity. But here's where, as you hinted, it gets really interesting, maybe even confusing for a while. The maternal lineage. Traced through mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, passed only from mother to children. This has presented a much more complex and actually fiercely debated story for quite some time.
That's absolutely right. This has been a hot topic. For years, you had two prominent and, frankly, seemingly contradictory views emerging from major genetic studies. It led to a lot of discussion, a lot of reevaluation in the scientific community.
What were these two main views?
Okay, so on one side, you had a landmark study by Behar and colleagues back in 2006. They analyzed over 1,000 mitochondrial DNA samples, a huge data set for the time.
And their conclusion?
Their conclusion was quite remarkable. They suggested that about 40%, nearly half of today's Ashkenazi mtDNA, descends from just 4 women, 4 founding mothers.
4 women, for almost half the population's maternal ancestry.
That was their finding. And they proposed these 4 women were, quote, likely from a Hebrew Levantine mtDNA pool originating in the Middle East, possibly as early as the 1st or 2nd century CE.
So very early Middle Eastern origin for these major maternal lines.
That was their argument. They further argued that the remaining maybe 150 or so maternal founders were also predominantly Middle Eastern, and their findings generally argued against significant European gene flow into the Ashkenazi maternal line. It painted a picture of strong Near Eastern maternal continuity, mirroring the paternal side.
Okay, that sounds fairly consistent. But
Yeah,
then
it
you said there was a contradictory view.
Indeed. Then came a study by Richards and his team in 2013. They used a different approach, analyzing the entire mitochondrial DNA genome, which gives more detail.
And they found something different.
Dramatically different. They challenged Behar's conclusions quite directly. Their findings suggested that over 80%, 80% of Ashkenazi maternal ancestry actually came from women indigenous to Europe.
80% European, not Middle Eastern.
Mostly European, according to their analysis, primarily from prehistoric Western Europe, with Italian and Old French origins being prominent possibilities. They estimated only about 8% of maternal lines came directly from the Near East.
Wow, that's almost a complete flip.
It really seemed like it. This perspective strongly suggested a significant role for the conversion of women in Europe during the formation of Ashkenazi communities. It led to this idea of a split origin. The males came from the Middle East, but they married mostly local European women who converted.
Which would explain the discrepancy between Y-DNA and mtDNA results in that scenario.
Exactly. That was the implication. But, of course, the debate didn't just stop there. Science rarely does.
Right. Someone must have pushed back.
Fernandez and colleagues, in 2014, they counter-argued. They looked at specific mtDNA haplogroups found in Ashkenazi women, like haplogroup K, which is quite common.
Okay.
And they argued that the specific types of haplogroup K found in Ashkenazi populations still pointed strongly towards an ancient Near Eastern matrilineal origin, which actually supported Behar's original claims.
So back towards Middle Eastern origins again?
It seemed to lean back that way. So you can see it was a complex puzzle. Different studies using advanced techniques, but maybe different analytical frameworks or reference populations, were arriving at quite different interpretations. How do you define the geographical origin of a lineage that's thousands of years old? It's tricky.
It sounds like a proper scientific debate, but you mentioned there's a very recent development, something that might be shifting this understanding again.
Yes, this is really fresh off the press, so to speak. A 2025 study by Joseph Livny and Karl Skarecki is a major name in Jewish genetics research.
Okay, Livny and Skarecki 2025. What did they do differently?
They examined mitochondrial DNA again, but they used a new, much more refined analytical method. This approach was specifically designed to try and distinguish between founder lineages, the ones that came from that original small population bottleneck.
Right.
And absorbed lineages, those that might have been integrated later on, maybe from outside populations through intermarriage or conversion over the many centuries after the founding event.
Trying to separate the original signal from later noise, essentially.
That's a good way to put it. And their findings are really compelling, and they seem to fundamentally reframe this whole debate.
What do they find?
They indicate that most Ashkenazi maternal lineages actually trace back to that small founding group. They estimate around 150 individuals, women, contributed to the founding mtDNA pool.
Okay, a small founding group, consistent with the bottleneck idea.
Very consistent. But crucially, and this is where it really contradicts some of those earlier theories suggesting massive European female input, they found that fewer than 15% of present-day Ashkenazi Jews carry absorbed mtDNA from outside populations.
Fewer than 15%, so the vast majority comes from the original founders.
That's what their analysis strongly suggests. Over 85% comes from that initial small founding group.
So what does that imply about the origin of those founders?
Well, this result directly challenges those earlier theories that suggested significant mixed origins, especially the idea of Near Eastern men marrying predominantly European women. Instead, the Livny and Skarecki study supports a unified origin for both maternal and paternal lineages in the Near East.
A unified origin, both male and female lines tracing back primarily to the Middle East.
That's the major implication of their findings. It's a significant shift, suggesting a much more consistent narrative across both male and female lines than was debated previously. It implies that while, sure, there might have been minor instances of intermarriage and gene flow over the centuries, the core genetic blueprint for the maternal lines, just like the paternal lines, appears rooted in the Middle East.
So what does this all mean for the maternal story then? It sounds like the newest research is circling back, using more advanced methods, to a more unified Middle Eastern origin for the entire founding population, both male and female. Less of that split origin idea.
It certainly seems to be pointing strongly in that direction. This latest study from Livni and Skorecki, assuming it holds up to further scrutiny and replication, which is always key in science,
Of course.
it would really unify the genetic narrative of Ashkenazi origins. It aligns the maternal and paternal lineages much more consistently with a predominantly Near Eastern founding event, followed by that intense bottleneck.
So maybe not zero European admixture on the female side over time, but the founding mothers themselves were largely Middle Eastern.
That seems to be the picture emerging now. The founding maternal lineages appear primarily Near Eastern, similar to the paternal lines. It powerfully reinforces the idea of that significant genetic bottleneck and a high degree of endogamy shaping this population right from an early stage, giving them their distinct genetic profile.
That's a huge clarification. It brings a lot more coherence to the genetic narrative.
It really does seem to.
Okay, so we've looked at the direct male line, Y-DNA, and the direct female line, mtDNA, with the latest research suggesting a more unified Middle Eastern origin for both founding populations than previously thought. But what about the full genetic picture, the autosomal DNA?
Right, the autosomal DNA.
This reflects contributions from all ancestors, across generations, not just those single lines. It must tell an even more nuanced story about broader mixing and population structure.
Absolutely. Autosomal DNA gives you that comprehensive view, looking at all the chromosomes, not just the Y or the mitochondria.
Mm-hmm.
And it tells a nuanced story that actually largely supports both those Near Eastern roots and significant connections to Southern Europe, consistent with the historical migrations we've discussed.
So how does it show that Southern European connection?
Well, several studies have pointed this way. For instance, Selden and colleagues back in 2006 showed that Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews consistently cluster together genetically. And importantly, they also cluster fairly closely with Southern European populations. Think Italians, Greeks, Portuguese, Spaniards.
Closer to them than to Northern Europeans?
Generally, yes. It's highly consistent with a later Mediterranean origin or passage for these Jewish groups after their initial dispersal from the Middle East. It suggests a shared genetic heritage that passed through or perhaps mixed within that Mediterranean region.
And other studies found similar things.
Yes, Boscia et al. In 2007 found that Ashkenazim clustered most closely with Arabic North African populations again, that Mediterranean basin connection, and within Europe again most closely with Greeks and Southern Italians. He keeps pointing back to those East Mediterranean origins and subsequent time spent in Southern Europe.
What about the relationship between different Jewish groups themselves? Does autosomal DNA confirm they are closely related despite being scattered across the globe?
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the most consistent findings. Atzmon Ostra et al. In 2010 confirmed a very close genetic relationship among various diverse Jewish groups. They looked at Ashkenazi, Iranian, Iraqi, Syrian, Italian, Turkish, Greek, Jew.
A wide range.
A very wide range. And they found these groups are much more closely related to each other genetically than they are to their non-Jewish countrymen, the populations they lived amongst for centuries.
So a clear shared heritage.
A clear shared foundational Middle Eastern heritage that binds these diverse communities together genetically. They specifically estimated that Ashkenazi Jews shared common ancestors in the Middle East about 2,500 years ago.
Which aligns well with historical timelines.
Very well. Right around the period of the Second Temple and the beginnings of the major diaspora. Interestingly, they also noted that modern-day Italians appear to be the closest non-Jewish European group to Ashkenazi Jews.
Italians again. Why?
Well, they speculated about possible intermarriage and conversions back during the Roman Empire, suggesting a period of significant interaction and maybe gene flow in Italy before the main migrations north into the Rhineland and Eastern Europe began.
So definitely a strong Middle Eastern core and a significant Southern European layer or connection in the autosomal DNA. What about the overall level of European admixture generally, looking at the whole genome? How much is European versus Middle Eastern?
The precise estimates vary a bit between studies, which isn't surprising. It depends on the methodologies used, the reference populations they compare against, how exactly you define European versus Middle Eastern ancestry thousands of years ago.
Right, it's not simple.
Not at all. But all the studies point to a significant European component, Bray et al. In 2010, estimated maybe 35–55% of the modern Ashkenazi genome might be of European origin.
So potentially close to half.
Potentially. And they noted this was considerably higher than the Y chromosome estimates of European input were showing at the time, which led them to conclude there must have been significant interbreeding or admixture between Middle Eastern and European populations, likely involving more female European ancestors than male.
which fits with some of the earlier mtDNA debate, though maybe not the very latest findings. What about more recent estimates?
More recently, a study by Zhu, Karmi et al. In 2017 estimated the European component potentially even higher, perhaps around 50–70%.
50 to 70%.
Again, with the caveat about estimation methods. But they specified it was mostly Southern European-like ancestry, with only a minority Eastern European component. The remaining ancestry, estimated around 30–50%, was clearly Middle Eastern, showing the strongest affinity to Levantine populations like the Druze and Lebanese.
So, still reinforcing that dual origin, Middle East and primarily Southern Europe.
Exactly. It's a complex blend, truly reflecting that history of migration and interaction over millennia.
How does the Erfurt 2022 study, with its ancient DNA, refine this broader autosomal picture specifically for the medieval period? Does it match up?
It offers incredible direct insight, and yes, it largely confirms and refines what we infer from modern autosomal DNA. It showed, as we mentioned, that by the 14th century, Ashkenazi Jews in Erfurt had already acquired their main sources of genetic ancestry, including those significant components from both the Middle East and Europe, including Eastern Europe.
And that mix stayed stable afterwards.
Remarkably stable. Very little change in those overall ancestry proportions for the next 600 years, right up to today. This strongly suggests that the primary admixture events, the blending of Middle Eastern and European ancestries, had largely occurred before or during the early to high Middle Ages, solidifying the core Ashkenazi genetic profile quite early on. But Erfurt also revealed that crucial insight into the internal structure back then. Remember the archipelago of communities.
Right, no homogeneous.
Exactly. Medieval Ashkenazi Jews weren't a single genetic block. They had internal divisions. One group looked more like Western European Ashkenazi today, Rhineland descendants. Another had more Eastern European ancestry mixed in.
Suggesting different migration histories or local interactions even within the medieval Ashkenazi world.
Precisely. It underscores that Ashkenazi identity and genetics formed through this dynamic process over centuries, with regional variations contributing to the overall genetic mosaic we see later.
And did Erfurt confirm that Mediterranean link again from the full autosomal data?
Yes, strongly. The autosomal DNA from medieval Erfurt reinforces that a key source of the pre-medieval Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry is related to people living today in Mediterranean Southern Europe. It fits the timeline perfectly. Near East Mediterranean, Central Eastern Europe.
And the bottleneck, did autosomal DNA confirm that too?
Compellingly, the analysis of the full genomes in Erfurt provided clear evidence for that very small effective population size during the first centuries of the second millennium CE. That small size is what allowed specific mutations, including disease mutations, to drift to unusually high frequencies, the classic genetic signature of a founder event.
So all lines of evidence, Y-DNA, mtDNA, ancient autosomal DNA, seem to converge on this picture. Middle Eastern origins, significant passage mixing in Southern Europe, a major early bottleneck, high endogamy afterwards, and distinct Ashkenazi profile solidified by the Middle Ages.
That's a pretty good summary of the current consensus, yes. The details get debated, the percentages might shift slightly with new studies, but the broad strokes are remarkably consistent across different types of genetic evidence now.
Okay. This brings us squarely to a major point of discussion, and sometimes, frankly, major controversy that has persisted for decades. The Khazar hypothesis.
Ah, yes, the Khazars.
What exactly is this theory, and why has it captured so much attention, often leading to, well, heated debates and sometimes deeply problematic interpretations?
Yeah, it's one of the most fascinating aspects here, how persistent this hypothesis has been. Often, its critics call it the Khazar myth.
So what's the core idea?
The basic suggestion is that Ashkenazi Jews are primarily descended, not from the ancient Israelites of the Middle East, but from converts to Judaism among the Khazars.
And who are the Khazars?
The Khazars were a multi-ethnic, mostly Turkic-speaking people. They formed a large, semi-nomadic empire, a Khanate that controlled a vast territory in the Caucasus region, the Pontic-Caspian steppe, basically southern Russia and Ukraine from the late 6th century CE up until the 10th or 11th century.
And the theory is that these Khazars converted to Judaism.
There is historical evidence that the Khazar ruling elite, the nobility, and possibly parts of the population did indeed convert to Judaism sometime around the 8th or 9th century. That part isn't really disputed.
Okay, so the hypothesis builds on that.
Yes. The hypothesis postulates that after the Khazar Empire collapsed, mainly due to invasions by Kiev around the 10th century, these converted Khazars migrated westward into Eastern Europe. And the theory claims They formed the primary ancestors of Ashkenazi Jewry.
So replacing the Middle Eastern origin story with a Turkic Caucasian one?
Essentially, yes, or at least proposing it as the dominant origin for Eastern European Jews.
Where did this idea come from originally?
Well, the speculation about a Khazar origin for some of Europe's Jewish populations actually dates back quite a way, at least to 1808, with a historian named Johann Urs. Later, Ernest Renan, a quite famous French philosopher and historian, popularized the idea in 1883.
What did Renan say?
He proposed, and this is quite provocative, that the great masses of Jewish populations in the Danube region and southern Russia have in all probability nothing or almost nothing that is anthropologically Jewish in them, strongly implying a Khazar origin.
Why did this idea gain traction?
Well, it offered an alternative explanation for the presence of such a large Jewish population in Eastern Europe, which seemed to grow rapidly in the later Middle Ages. And perhaps for some, it addressed perceived physical differences between some Eastern European Jews and stereotypes of Middle Eastern peoples.
And it really burst into wider public consciousness much later in the 20th century. Right?
Absolutely. Arthur Koestler's 1976 book, The 13th Tribe, was a bestseller. It brought the hypothesis to a massive public audience, making really sweeping claims for a Khazar legacy among Ashkenazi Jews.
Koestler wasn't a historian or a geneticist, though.
No, he was a novelist and essayist. His book was influential culturally, but not really based on rigorous historical or emerging genetic evidence. Interestingly, Koestler himself argued that this theory might actually help mitigate racially based anti-Semitism.
How so?
His thinking was, if Ashkenazi Jews weren't racially Semitic, but were descended from Khazars, it would undermine the core racial purity claims of Nazism and other forms of anti-Semitism, a controversial argument itself.
Has anyone tried to revive it more recently using genetics?
Yes, there have been attempts. A geneticist named Aaron L. Hike published studies starting around 2013 trying to vindicate the hypothesis. He proposed a Judaist Khazar kingdom as a core transit area and origin point. He even controversially suggested Yiddish originated near villages named Ashkenaz in eastern Turkey, not Germany, trying to link language and geography to the Khazar theory.
Okay, so there's this persistent historical speculation, Koestler's popular book, and some more recent attempts to find genetic backing. Given all that, what does the actual scientific consensus in modern genetic research say about the Khazar hypothesis? Is there any substance to it?
The scientific consensus on this is really quite clear, and it's remarkably consistent across numerous independent research groups and large-scale studies. Genetic studies have found no substantive evidence of a significant Khazar origin among Ashkenazi Jews.
No significant evidence.
None that hold up to scrutiny. Now, it's challenging to test directly, partly because we don't have confirmed ancient Khazar DNA or clearly identifiable modern descendants of the Khazars to use as a perfect comparison group.
Right, that makes it harder.
It does. But comprehensive studies have looked for genetic markers that would be expected if there was a large input from populations in the Caucasus or the historical Khazar region. And they consistently find no such markers at any significant level in Ashkenazi Jews. Their genetic profile consistently points elsewhere to the Middle East and Europe.
Can you give an example of a major study that addressed this?
Sure. That big 2013 transgenome study led by Behar, involving a huge international team and the largest data set available at the time, specifically looking at Ashkenazi origins. They explicitly looked for this.
Yeah.
Their conclusion was unambiguous. No indication of a significant genetic contribution either from within or from north of the Caucasus region, zeroing in on where the Khazar contribution would likely have come from.
So a major study designed to look for it found nothing.
Exactly. They consistently reiterated that Ashkenazi Jews derive their ancestry primarily from populations of the Middle East and Europe, and they share substantial ancestry with other Jewish populations globally, just as we've been discussing. The Khazar link just wasn't showing up in the data.
What about that R1A haplogroup we talked about, the one found in Levites, which is common in Eastern Europe? Couldn't that be a Khazar link?
That was one avenue proponents explored, but as we discussed, it's been pretty firmly debunked.
How so again?
The later, more refined studies by Behar and others in 2013 and 2017 showed that the specific type of R1A found in Ashkenazi Levites, that R1AY2619 subclade, is Near Eastern in origin, not European or Khazar. It actually points away from a Khazar contribution for that lineage.
So that door is closed too, genetically. What about L. Hike's work trying to revive the theory?
His genetic methods and conclusions have faced widespread criticism from other leading geneticists in the field. His work has been described using terms like unrealistic, representing an outlier minority view and employing defective methodology. The mainstream view is that his analyses don't accurately reflect the known genetic patterns.
And the linguistic argument about Yiddish.
Linguists also firmly push back against that. The consensus among linguists is overwhelmingly that Yiddish is fundamentally a Germanic language, specifically High German, with clear influences from Hebrew, Aramaic, and later Slavic. It notably lacks any significant Turkic traces, which you would absolutely expect if the population speaking it were primarily descended from Turkic-speaking Khazars.
So neither the genetics nor the linguistics seem to support it.
Correct. The overwhelming scientific evidence from multiple fields points away from a significant Khazar origin for Ashkenazi Jews.
Which raises that important question. Why does this theory persist so strongly? Why does it keep coming up, getting debated, even in the face of this scientific evidence refuting it?
That's where the discussion often, unfortunately, ventures into deeply problematic territory.
Oh, so?
If you connect this to the bigger picture, the persistence of the Khazar hypothesis, despite the lack of solid historical or genetic support, is often because it gets cited in political arguments and, frankly, often in anti-Semitic arguments.
In what way? How is it used?
The theory is frequently used to claim that modern Jews, particularly Ashkenazi Jews, are not true descendants of the ancient Israelites.
Ah, I see.
And this claim is then often used to try and discredit the historical connection and claim of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. It becomes a tool for anti-Zionism, arguing that the people returning have no historical right because they're supposedly descended from Khazars, not ancient Judeans.
Have there been concrete examples of this misuse?
Oh, numerous examples throughout history and continuing today. It was reportedly cited in UN debates back in 1947 to try and oppose the creation of a Jewish state, arguing those seeking a homeland weren't historically connected to it. Figures like Benjamin H. Friedman, who was an American businessman and a vocal anti-Semite in the mid-20th century, heavily promoted the Khazar theory to deny Jewish lineage and push anti-Zionist narratives.
And it was used elsewhere, too.
Yes, it was a prominent feature in Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda and anti-Semitism. Some Soviet historians depicted the Khazars negatively, and Khazar sometimes became a coded anti-Semitic slur in certain Russian nationalist circles.
Still used today.
Unfortunately, yes. It continues to fuel anti-Semitic narratives online and among extremist groups. It's been embraced by elements within the white supremacist Christian identity movement in the U.S., and even by fringe groups like the Japanese doomsday cult Arum Shinrikyo, who used it to claim Jews weren't true Jews and were plotting world domination.
Wow. So it's been weaponized quite extensively.
It absolutely has, and it's just crucial for listeners to understand that these uses are not supported by the actual historical or genetic facts. They overwhelmingly serve a political or hateful agenda aimed at denying Jewish identity, history, or rights. The science simply doesn't back up the claims made by these groups.
Okay, so we've explored the origins, the migrations, the genetics, the controversies. But our deep dive isn't just about where people came from. It's also about the implications of those origins for today.
Right.
What does all this genetic knowledge mean for Ashkenazi Jews now, particularly in the realm of medical genetics? This must be an incredibly important area given everything we've discussed about their unique population history, like the bottleneck.
It's a hugely important area, and one where the study of Ashkenazi genetics have had a massive tangible impact. Jewish populations in general, but especially the Ashkenazi, have been studied very extensively in medical and population genetics.
Why so extensively?
Well, it stems directly from that unique demographic history we've talked about, particularly the combination of that severe genetic bottleneck early on, followed by centuries of high endogamy.
Marrying within the group.
Exactly. That combination has led to specific genetic patterns that have really important practical medical implications.
How does that work, the bottleneck in endogamy leading to medical issues?
Well, think about the bottleneck. The population shrinks dramatically, maybe just a few hundred founders. If, just by chance, one of those founders carried a rare mutation for a genetic disease,
Okay.
as the population recovers and expands from those few founders, that initially rare mutation can become much, much more common in the descendant population than it would be in the general population where it might get diluted out.
The founder effect makes rare things less rare within that group.
Precisely. And then the high degree of endogamy people marrying within the group over centuries means these specific mutations tend to stay concentrated within the population rather than spreading out more widely.
So this combination leads to higher frequencies of certain genetic conditions.
Yes. Higher frequencies of specific genetic variations, including certain mutations that cause disease, particularly recessive diseases where you need 2 copies of the gene to be affected.
Can you give us some concrete examples, conditions that are known to be more common in the Ashkenazi population?
Sure. There are several well-known examples. Tay-Sachs disease is probably one of the most famous. It's a devastating neurological disorder, fatal in early childhood if a child inherits 2 copies of the faulty gene.
Right, I've heard of that.
Others include Gaucher disease, which is a metabolic disorder, Canavan disease, another neurological condition. Cystic fibrosis has certain mutations more common in Ashkenazi Jews. And there's also an increased risk for certain types of hereditary cancers, notably breast and ovarian cancer, linked to specific mutations in the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes.
BRCA mutations, right.
And also an increased risk for certain types of hereditary colon cancer, like Lynch syndrome. These are just a few of the more prominent examples from a list of conditions sometimes referred to as Ashkenazi Jewish genetic diseases, although many occur in other populations too, just often at lower frequencies. It is important, though, to add a note of caution here.
Okay.
Because Ashkenazi Jews have been studied so intensively for these conditions, it can sometimes create a slightly misleading impression that they are inherently more susceptible to genetic diseases overall than other groups.
You mean that's not necessarily true?
Not necessarily in terms of the total burden of genetic disease. It's partly due to what geneticists call ascertainment bias.
Ascertainment bias.
Yeah. Because this population has been studied so thoroughly, and because their specific genetic history with the bottleneck makes these conditions easier to identify and track, they get found, characterized, and publicized more readily within this community.
So we just know more about the specific genetic risks in this group because they've been studied so much?
Exactly. It doesn't automatically mean their overall genetic health is worse than other populations, just that our understanding of these specific, often recessive conditions is much more advanced within this particular community.
That's a really important clarification. So it's not that they are uniquely burdened, but maybe uniquely well studied in this regard, thanks to that distinct genetic history.
That's a very good way to put it.
And what are the truly practical, maybe even life-saving applications of having all this detailed knowledge?
The practical applications are incredibly valuable, and they really demonstrate the immense benefit of this kind of population-specific genetic research.
How so?
Well, this extensive genetic understanding has directly led to the development of highly effective genetic counseling and carrier screening programs specifically tailored for the Ashkenazi population.
Carrier screening. Testing healthy people to see if they carry a gene.
Exactly. Testing healthy individuals, often young adults before they start families, to see if they carry 1 copy of a recessive gene mutation for conditions like Tay-Sachs, Canavan, cystic fibrosis, Gaucher, and others.
And how does knowing that help?
If 2 prospective parents are both identified as carriers for the same recessive condition, they know they have a 1 in 4 chance with each pregnancy of having a child affected by the severe form of the disease.
Right.
Armed with that knowledge, they have options. They can make informed decisions about family planning, potentially utilizing prenatal diagnosis or pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, PGD, with IVF to ensure their children don't inherit 2 copies of the harmful gene.
So it allows for prevention.
Precisely. Organizations like Yeshurim, for example, operate large-scale confidential screening programs primarily within Orthodox Jewish communities. They test individuals and essentially check for genetic compatibility between potential marriage partners, specifically to avoid carrier couples unknowingly having children with these devastating recessive diseases.
Wow, that must have had a huge impact.
It's dramatically reduced the incidence of diseases like Tay-Sachs in the communities where screening is widespread. It highlights how understanding population genetics, even complex histories involving migrations and bottlenecks, can have direct, positive, and literally life-saving impacts on public health.
That's incredible. It really transforms that abstract historical and genetic knowledge into tangible health benefits.
It's a truly powerful testament to the value of genetic research when it's applied thoughtfully, ethically, and in partnership with the community it affects.
Okay, so what does this all mean? We have covered a remarkable amount of ground today, seriously. From ancient migrations out of the Middle East, moving through Europe, digging into cutting-edge ancient DNA studies, modern genetics, the controversies.
It's been a journey.
It really has. For you, our listener, what are the core takeaways? The main things you should walk away with after this deep dive into Ashkenazi history and genetics.
Okay, let's try and boil it down. I think the first core takeaway is just acknowledging the sheer complexity and dynamism of Ashkenazi Jewish history.
Not a simple story.
Not at all. Their journey was shaped over centuries by migration, starting in the Middle East, moving into and across Europe. Driven by this mix of economic opportunities, sometimes the pursuit of new freedoms, but also, very often, by devastating persecution and displacement. It's a story of constant movement, adaptation, and an incredibly enduring sense of collective identity.
Right. Complex history. What's takeaway number 2? Genetics.
Yeah, genetics. The consensus now points strongly to a dual Middle Eastern and European ancestry. But the pattern is becoming clearer and maybe more unified than we thought even a decade ago.
How so?
Well, the paternal lines, the Y chromosome, consistently show predominantly Middle Eastern origins. And now, the most recent and detailed maternal evidence, the mtDNA studies like that Livni and Skorecki one from 2025, that's significantly bolstering the case for primarily Middle Eastern origin for the founding maternal lineages as well.
So a more unified Middle Eastern foundation for both sides of the family tree, followed by the bottleneck.
That seems to be the emerging picture, suggesting a more cohesive foundational genetic story than the split origin model proposed earlier. Then, of course, admixture and drift shaped things further.
Okay. Unified origin, bottleneck. What's a third key point?
I think the findings from ancient DNA, like the Erfurt study, are really crucial. They showed us, maybe surprisingly, that medieval Ashkenazi communities were actually more diverse internally, genetically, than many had previously imagined.
The archipelago idea.
Exactly. They weren't a single homogeneous block back then. There were distinct subgroups, even within the medieval Ashkenazi world, reflecting different local histories before they later coalesced more into the population structure we see today, especially post-Holocaust.
Fascinating. Okay, fourth takeaway. Has to be the Khazar thing, right?
Absolutely. Very important takeaway.
Yeah.
The Khazar hypothesis, while it's been historically debated and certainly captures the imagination, consistently lacks scientific support from genetic studies.
The evidence just isn't there.
The genetic evidence and linguistic evidence simply doesn't support a significant Khazar ancestry for Ashkenazi Jews. And it's crucial to be aware that attempts to use this theory often serve problematic political or anti-Semitic agendas. The science does not back those claims.
Got it. And finally, a fifth takeaway.
I think it's the practical application. Understanding Ashkenazi genetics isn't just academic. It has direct, tangible benefits in medical screening and disease prevention.
The founder effect mutations.
Exactly. That unique population structure, shaped by bottlenecks and endogamy over centuries, has led to specific genetic patterns. Understanding those patterns allows for targeted health interventions, like carrier screening, which offers real, often life-saving benefits to the community today.
Okay, so complex history, increasingly unified genetic origin from the Middle East via Southern Europe, bottleneck, medieval diversity, Khazar hypothesis debunked by science, and real medical relevance today.
That covers the main points, I think.
It really is a story of incredible resilience, isn't it? Profound adaptation, a deep, multifaceted connection to history, all revealed right there in the threads of our DNA. We really hope this deep dive has given you, our listener, a fresh perspective and maybe some surprising insights into the Ashkenazi Jewish story.
And maybe something to think about going forward. Consider this. We live in an age of increasing global movement, constant intermixing, populations shifting and blending arguably faster than ever before.
Yeah, that's true.
What might future genetic studies reveal about the formation of today's rapidly changing populations? Think about communities forming right now through migration and admixture. And how will those insights, maybe decades or centuries from now, shape our descendants' understanding of identity, of belonging, of shared heritage? It's history and genetics happening in real time.
That's a fascinating thought to end on. How will the stories we're creating today be read in the genes of the future? Join us next time for another deep dive into the information you share with us. Until then, keep digging for knowledge.